All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the Breakthroughs in Water Security Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Jeff McDonald, and on behalf of the Global Institute for Water Security and the Global Water Futures Project, both of whom are underwriting this series, I'd like to welcome you to this week's event. Before we get going, I want to just remind you that next week we have Kathy Wilson coming to us from Los Alamos National Lab. She'll be talking about Arctic land models. And also, before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Métis, and we pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'm very happy to welcome Brad Wilcox to us today. And again, it's so sad that we can't have this in person, because I've known Brad for many years, and he's just a lovely colleague. We've had great times together over many events that he's organized. Brad is the Sid Kyle Professor of Semi-Arid Eco-Hydrology at Texas A&M University. He's in the Department of Ecology and Conservation Biology there. He's been a faculty member at Texas A&M for the past 20 years, but I think it's notable that prior to that, he was the Chief Scientific Officer at the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. And he's also been a research hydrologist at Los Alamos for some years prior to that. So Brad has a long and rich history in eco-hydrology, and his work over these past 3 decades, I'd say, is focused on the links between vegetation cover and the water cycle. And that's going to be the topic of the talk today, and the paper that the students in the Journal Club will discuss a little later on. But Brad has really been a thought leader in this new and growing field of eco-hydrology through AGU and the Eco-Hydrology Technical Committee, but also leading 3, I think, very successful AGU Chapman conferences on eco-hydrology. And I think these have really galvanized the field as it's developed over the last one and a half decades. He's leading big projects. He's currently leading a $10 million project funded by USDA aimed at management techniques, woody plants and rangelands across the Great Plains. And he has a number of accolades in addition to his endowed chair. In 2018, he was awarded the Outstanding Achievement Award by the Society of Range Management, among other things. And we're very privileged, I think, to have Brad with us, coming with us from Eastern Washington today. So Brad, the floor is yours, and I'll turn it over to you. And thanks so much again for joining us.
Well, Jeff, thank you for those comments. Everybody, it's definitely pleasure to be here today. And I hope that what I have to say is of interest to you. Jeff, be sure to let me know if there are any issues with the video or hearing me or whatnot. In any case, what I want to talk about today broadly is the eco-hydrology of what I call grassland biomes. But more specifically, a question that has really driven my research for the last 20 years is what are the implications of the changing landscapes in these dry lands, specifically the conversion of mainly grassy cover to woody cover. And the photo that you see here is a picture of the savanna systems in northern Texas that 150 years ago, these were grasslands. And of course, it goes without saying, I think any of us in academia realize this, that really the people that get things done, that generate the ideas, that really make a program successful are the students and the collaborators. And I would be remiss not acknowledging all of the hard and creative work that my collaborators and students have done in the past. Specifically today, I'll be talking about research that 3 of my recent PhD students have just completed. So in terms of the structure of my talk, the first thing that I want to try to do is convince you that this is an interesting question, not just the woody plant encroachment question, but really the shift from either mainly a woody state or a forest state to a grassland state, or vice versa. Second, I'll be talking just a little bit of background about woody plant encroachment and what is it exactly. For you students who are listening, one thing that I've like to do is try to couch most of my work in some sort of viable or contemporary theory, and be touching a little bit on this alternative stable state theory. In terms of eco-hydrology, oftentimes when we're describing what is eco-hydrology, we cast it in terms of being an interaction of the water cycle and the ecosystems. And that's the way I'm trying to present my work today, but I'll be presenting 4 case studies, places that we've worked at, looking at how the water cycle has changed with this conversion from mainly grass cover to woody plant cover. In doing that, I'll also be presenting this work in relation to some contemporary eco-hydrological theory, specifically a little bit about this question of ET partitioning, how much is evaporation, how much is transpiration. Some of the work I'll be relating to a concept that Jeff has been very instrumental in bringing forward, the 2 water worlds, or the eco-hydrological separation idea. But the big concept that I hope I can get across is this idea of eco-hydrological connectivity, and that the woody plant encroachment in many cases fundamentally alters this eco-hydrological connectivity, basically the way that surface runoff is redistributed across these landscapes, and that this has important implications. You know, as just speaking for myself, and I think it's fairly common when I see other academics as they progress in their career, is that you want to do something that really makes a difference in terms of these complex problems. And in the last decade, I've gotten interested in approaching woody plant encroachment from using this coupled human natural systems approach. We were fortunate enough to get an NSF grant to bring together a team of people to look at it using that landscape, idea. And then finally, that has led to some ideas of how can we manage these landscapes in a sustainable way. So the question of this dynamic of woody plant cover versus grass cover is actually an amazingly broad phenomena that's happening across the globe, especially with global change happening. But just a couple of examples that woody plant encroachment is part of this change that we're seeing on the planet. One big change is agricultural conversion, converting these either forests or grasslands into agricultural production. And some of the photographs I'm sharing here, just my own personal experience with that. We've done quite a bit of work in northeastern Brazil and the Brazilian shrublands, the Caatinga. Much of that has been plowed up for agriculture, but of course that is happening all over the globe, especially now very much in South America. Another very, very big phenomena is that of afforestation, and this is really quite controversial in terms of many, many grasslands are being converted to forests with the idea of perhaps enhancing the carbon sequestration, but I think the best example of afforestation and restoration has been the Loess Plateau, which has actually been quite successful in terms of reducing erosion. An example that, in terms that's close to my home in College Station, Texas, is that the landscape has gone through a number of changes. Agricultural conversion, land abandonment, and then ultimately what we call thicketization of many of these landscapes that were once plowed up. An example that I'm sure many or most of you are very, very familiar with in Canada is tree die-off. I actually had the opportunity to do a 2-week gravel ride across Colorado this summer, and I was just flabbergasted in terms of the amount of forests that have died off in Colorado. In each of these examples, now this is just one of dozens of examples, the fires that have been happening this summer, the conversion of the many tropical forests to shrubby savannas. But in any case, for me, the fascinating question is, how do these changes affect the water cycle? So back to woody encroachment specifically, many of you maybe perhaps in Canada, it's not such a common thing, although I know in some places of Canada it is. But for those of you who might not be familiar with it, it's very really just simply the expansion of woody plant cover in what were once open savannas or grasslands. And there are myriad reasons why this is happening. I'll show some slides here in just a little bit, but I mean, it's happening all over the globe, especially in drylands. And it's driven or has been driven by, in many cases, overgrazing, and that has affected fire regimes. But there are other factors as well, depending on where you are in Africa. It has been attributed to change in the main grazers, or they say in some cases where elephants are no longer a major grazer, then that has been attributed to woody plant encroachment. Certainly the increase in carbon dioxide in many places, as atmospheric carbon dioxide is leading to that. But in any case, it's just happened really all over the planet. And just some across the tropics. The grassy biomes have been dramatically transformed. In drylands, in more northern Africa, and then also the western United States, another very major transformation. Many of you may be familiar with what's happening in Alaska and perhaps northern Canada as well, that tundra is being shifted to a more woody plant cover. And in this case, it's not related to fire, but my understanding is related to change in permafrost. And then what I'll be highlighting today is the Great Plains of the United States. And this may be the epicenter of woody plant encroachment in terms of really changing a large landscape area. In some cases, the woody plant encroachment has been used synonymously with degradation. I just want to emphasize that that's not necessarily true. It's certainly true in arid landscapes when you shift from desert grasslands to a more shrubby component, that goes hand in hand with degradation. But in more subhumid landscapes and in the tropics, that's not the case. It's doesn't result in more increased bare ground. And it's not necessarily a degraded landscape, and not necessarily even a bad landscape. It's just very, very different. Okay, so grassy biomes, this is often the term that's used to a catch-all for grasslands and savannas. But definitely these landscapes are disturbance-driven, and in particular, these landscapes have evolved under periodic and regular fire. Sometimes that was definitely enhanced by Native Americans in the United States. But then also there's an interaction between grazing animals as well. And so without these disturbance, or if these disturbance patterns are altered, then that leads to a change in vegetation cover. And that's exactly what's happened through certainly much of the Great Plains, which I will highlight. In terms of trying to put this under some sort of a theoretical construct, you can think about exogenous factors, which would be factors from the outside, versus endogenous. If we were in a modeling context where endogenous would be an opportunity for these different factors to interact, and that's what we're trying to illustrate in this diagram here, that there is an interaction between the grazing animal and fire and woody plants and grasses, and when that interaction is disrupted, then we get a change in the landscape. And a theoretical idea that I think has been really very useful and powerful one is this idea of an alternative stable state. And it's been applied for many kinds of ecological phenomena or many kinds of ecological change. But the woody plant encroachment has been really a classic example of the alternative state idea. And the basic idea is that once a landscape has crossed a certain threshold, it's very, very difficult for it to come back, and that the two very different states can exist under the same kinds of environmental interactions. And again, back to sort of trying to put this into a theoretical context, what we've done in terms of a recent paper is that with the disruption, for example, the grazing pressure is no longer endogenous, but it's exogenous. It's outside, it's independent of, say, the environment. People are putting on livestock irrespective of what's happening in terms of the landscape. And then even then eventually with, say we're wanting to, say, revert back to a grassland, say, okay, we're going to pull back on the grazing pressure, but then without some heroic restoration efforts, that's not able to happen. The other, and this is happening in terms of the shrubification of the landscape is happening from both directions. It's happening not only from the woody plant encroachments from the grassland standpoint, but also I'm sure many of you are aware then that with the degradation of forests, changing climate and whatnot, we're getting the savannahization of many of these former forest landscapes. So shrublands really are increasing across the globe. And in terms of my own research, but I guess in terms of if I were to summarize my focus, it's really trying to understand water dynamics and the water cycle on these shrubby landscapes. And this is just sort of photographs showing some places that we've done work in northeastern Brazil, southern Texas, cross timbers in Oklahoma, Sonora, Mexico. But it's striking in many cases how functionally similar all of these landscapes, or many of these landscapes, are. So the key question for me then, what are the implications of this change into the water cycle? And as Jeff said, I've been at Texas A&M for 2 decades now, and our research approach has been that doing detailed experimental work at plot scale and the hill slope scale, and again, basically asking the same question, how is it that the change in woody cover is influencing the water cycle, but coming at it from a different experimental perspective, looking at water chemistry, small watershed work, rainfall simulation on the hill slope scales, looking at interflow, micrometeorological measurements, and small scale work on tree cover. And then this multi approach in terms of experimental approach has been really useful in terms of, I think, developing a comprehensive understanding. But just to what has been very, very insightful is to take a look at historical stream flow across this region. In the United States, we're fortunate that the USGS started monitoring many of these rivers beginning around 1915. So we've got a nice long-term data set to look at to see whether or not these changes have had a large-scale influence on stream flow and indirectly groundwater recharge. Okay, so back to the Great Plains example. You know, when you think about the Great Plains, at least for many people, what automatically comes to mind is open, vast grasslands. And I did just kind of for my students, I did a Google search on Southern Great Plains for images, and the pictures that come up are mostly open, grassy landscapes, and that's what we think about. But the reality is far different now. This is composite satellite or image vegetation across Oklahoma, or Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And the green is woody plant cover. And what you can see is that, well, Texas is by far mainly a forested or a savanna landscape. In Oklahoma as well, it's becoming more forested, and even farther north in northern Great Plains, we're seeing this phenomenon. So here we go in terms of just a kind of a flash overview of the geography of the southern Great Plains. Bear with me here for just a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight the dramatic changes that are happening. Across the west, desert grasslands have disappeared and been replaced with these creosote shrublands. In South Texas, 200 years ago, was mostly open grasslands, and now they're referred to as the South Texas shrublands. The cross timbers areas in Oklahoma has been increasing in terms of woody plants with juniper cover. Rolling plains in Texas, again, if you look at the historical literature, this is described as a vast grassland, but it's now by and large a mesquite savanna. The Edwards Plateau in Texas, if you're not familiar with Texas geography, and I wouldn't expect most of you to be, but about 90,000 square miles in central Texas is an enormous karst landscape known as the Edwards Plateau. It's extremely important in terms of water resources. The renewable Edwards Aquifer provides water for San Antonio, Austin, and many of the sister cities around this burgeoning urban area in Texas. So a very important question has been, how has this conversion to woody plant cover affected water resources in this region? Rolling plains of Texas is now starting to become more encroached with woody plants. The point that I want to make is that the conversion, the timing of the conversion has differed depending, I think, on settlement patterns. Texas is basically probably as covered in woody plants as it's going to be. But an area of real concern is that across the Great Plains, eastern red cedar is continuing to expand. It's already quite advanced in Oklahoma, but it's advancing in Kansas and Nebraska as well. I'm not sure if you're seeing this in Canada or not, but many people are very, very concerned about this transition that's happening. And then finally, the one pocket of tallgrass prairie that's left in the United States, the Flint Hills in Oklahoma and Kansas, is also starting to experience woody plant encroachment in a contemporaneous manner. So the take-home message here is that this is a vastly altered landscape, and it's interesting that it's almost happened imperceptibly, and that many people don't really appreciate the dramatic change that's happened. So in terms of how I want to present, to give an overview of our findings, I'll be using this photographic collage repeatedly through the remaining part of my presentation. But you can think about, in terms of the influence on the water cycle, can be as a result of how the vegetation is modifying the water cycle directly, either through transpiration or infiltration. And just if I can linger on this a little bit, most people, when they think about how would trees potentially modify the water cycle, the change in transpiration is what most people immediately would attribute the effect to be. And this is true under certain situations, but what our research is showing is that for many cases, the big effect is actually the change, the increase in infiltration. A question that's been of much interest to me is there a larger scale effect in terms of the water cycle? And there is. I'll highlight that, but the effect differs very much whether or not the rivers are dominated by base flow. In other words, are they from a karst landscape, or are they mainly overland flow dominated? So I hope that this sort of photographic collage or conceptual idea makes sense to people, because I'll be repeatedly returning to it. Okay, I'll be giving 4 case studies, and then the dots on the map here show the case studies that I'll be presenting. This is obviously an image of the United States. The blue line is the demarcation of where potential evapotranspiration is less than precipitation. So all of you hydrologists who are listening, you know that when that happens, you're going to be getting more runoff. Then to the west of that line, where potential evapotranspiration is in some cases many times more higher than precipitation, and I believe that this is really an important demarcation in terms of the response of how the water cycle responds to woody plants. And the one location in the cross timbers of Oklahoma to the east of the PET line is an example where thanks that we know now, thanks in large part to the work by Chris So, who's a professor at Oklahoma State University, that he has demonstrated very effectively using many different techniques that the conversion of grasslands to woody plants is altering the water cycle, mainly because of the increased transpiration by the tree. So this is an example of, okay, yeah, this is what we expect will happen. And in fact, Chris has shown that you can see, if you look very carefully at stream flow, you can see the implications of this in the declining stream flow as a result of the woody plant encroachment. And Chris has been a close collaborator, and we've been very fortunate to be able to work with him, especially recently. Jean-Min's son, a PhD student who graduated just a few months ago, worked in the cross timbers with Chris and with myself, and he posed a very interesting question, and that is, does this shift from grasslands to woodlands affect evapotranspiration partitioning? And what Chris found through a number of sophisticated isotopic measurements, looking at isotopic composition of water vapor, is that in this particular landscape, transpiration is by far the dominant component of evapotranspiration, at least in the summertime. That is probably 90% of evapotranspiration. And that's a different result than what people have seen elsewhere in more semi-arid environments. The other thing that Chris demonstrated is that this holds true whether or not you're in an oak forest, a juniper forest, or an open grassland. And this work has been recently published if you're interested in it. All right, so that's sort of what we would expect, but I think the more interesting results are in the drier landscapes, and I just want to highlight that using 3 examples. And these results will not make sense unless you really understand the degradation history of the Great Plains and the southwestern United States. And, you know, we've all romanticized that cowboy era, at least many of us have in the United States. But that was really a very short time period in the history of our country. But basically from beginning around 1870, there were some very substantial changes across the West. Subduing of the Native Americans, the opening up of vast tracts of land that were not owned by anybody. Railroads were coming in, new technology such as windmill and barbed wire fences and whatnot. But in a period of less than 20 years, this landscape was absolutely devastated by livestock grazing, and we're still seeing the repercussions of that. This is kind of my own crude drawing of animal numbers in the southern Great Plains. And then how they've changed. But what I want to get across here is that beginning around 1870, animal numbers just absolutely exploded. But as you would expect, it was a very brief period of time before the landscape could no longer support these numbers. There was the inevitable crash. During World War I and World War II, high grazing levels were maintained. Because of a number of different socioeconomic changes that are happening, grazing numbers have actually dramatically declined across this landscape. Okay. And I've put together this cartoon to try to highlight the changes that have happened as a result of changes in grazing pressure. So initially, pre-1870, I imagine a pristine, mainly open prairie landscape. Beginning around 1870, just a very, very rapid degradation. The photograph there in the middle is from one of the experimental ranches that Texas A&M has. That's actually on the Edwards Plateau in 1940, and that's absolutely typical of what this landscape looked like. So with the overgrazing, what happened is the disappearance of fine fuels. I talked earlier about how this regular burning is so important in terms of maintaining grasslands. Fires could no longer be supported, and then eventually you get this gradual shift to a shrubland. And I'll be showing changes in stream flow, and I would like keep in mind this sequence of changes as you look at the changes in stream flow. So our stream flow measurements, again, begin around 1915, and that would be when the land was very, very degraded. Okay, just to emphasize the dramatic change that's happened in these landscapes, these are a couple of photos in the Edwards Plateau of Texas. Again, this is this karst landscape. One is from 1940, the other is 1963. This is on our experimental ranch in Sonora, Texas. And right now that the ranch is very well managed. And you can see that the change has been absolutely stunning. This is a place where not only has grazing levels been reduced, but they're reintroducing fire as well. The other site is not necessarily doing anything special in terms of management, but you can see though that there has been a very strong shift to a woody plant component, even though it may be continue to be overgrazed. But the big change is that there's a much more woody cover than there was even in 1963. Okay, so kind of just reiterating our conceptualization of this change, where you had the pristine open prairie of very, very degraded conditions in panel B, even up through to 1965. We've looked at animal numbers where we have the records, and animal numbers have declined precipitously, but even with the reduction in grazing, the woody plant cover remains. What we tried to do in the illustrating in the cartoons below is highlight some of the interactions that are happening. So in our current conditions is that even with light grazing, fire is not common in the landscape. It occurs, and the reason for that is that it requires catastrophic fires to burn this woody component, and that happens, but it doesn't happen on a very frequent basis. Okay, so this is the sort of my first example. This is the North Concho River that's in the rolling plains of Texas, and I've shown this mesquite savanna photograph before. And again, just to highlight, in 1850, this was mainly an open grassland. And the Concho River is, it's kind of one of my favorite examples because we've actually got, it was an unplanned, large-scale experiment. In around 1995, there was a lot of attention in the legislature about water supply in West Texas. And what people noticed is that the water flow in the Concho River had decreased precipitously. And this was about a 70% decline. And hopefully that's apparent in the graph on the upper left-hand corner. And there was basically a lot of enthusiasm for state-supported shrub control, with the idea being, again, that, well, it's obvious why the water has declined. The water has declined because the mesquite trees are using all of the water through the transpiration. There was a large-scale state-sponsored shrub removal experiment on this watershed, and this was about an 8,000 square kilometer watershed. So it was a large-scale effort. At least a third of the shrubs, a third of the landscape watershed was treated, and the expectation was that flow would come roaring back to what it was in the 1920s and the 1930s. I've got this blow up of the graph in the upper right-hand corner, and what you can see is that after shrub control, there was really no response at all. So we did a very detailed analysis. It was published in 2008 in Global Change Biology. Ewan Wang was the PhD student on that. And if you're looking very carefully at the streamflow data and the precipitation data, what we were able to make a strong argument that this river is mainly an overland flow dominated river. In other words, when there is flow in the river, it's overland flow and it's from relatively large rainfall events. And we broke up, just looking at a relationship between stream flow and precipitation in the early periods, 1926 to 1949, versus later period. And this is a log scale. So these changes are actually quite dramatic. But what we showed is that for a given amount of rainfall, there was much less stream flow after 1974. And the argument that we made was that this is both a result of the reduced overgrazing, so there was probably more herbaceous cover, but certainly more woody plant cover. And the argument we made is that what in fact is happening, what was contributing to the precipitous decline in stream flow, is that the landscape had essentially, from a hydrologic point of view, recovered, infiltrability had recovered, and that much more of the water was actually being stored in the soil and not running off as overland flow. And this turned out to be somewhat controversial because much of the woody plant, in order to manage the woody plants, landowners cannot really afford to do that, and they get subsidies from the federal government and the state, but the justification being that the state is justified in doing this because what it will do is increase the amount of water supply, and that our work basically demonstrated that was not really an effective way of increasing water supply. And so there are, even though the landscape is recovering from a hydrologic point of view, it's not, from an ecological point of view, it's very, very different, but from a hydrological point of view, I would argue and have argued that it's hydrologically healthy. There's not erosion happening. Water is going into the soil. Vegetation production is happening. But there are very important large-scale implications for water supply across an enormous region in Texas. Most of these reservoirs were built in the 1950s using data from that high runoff kind of regime. And now the reality is that most of these reservoirs are empty and that they're not effective in terms of water supply. So there are large-scale important water implications as a result of this change. Is this good or is this bad? I would argue that it's in spite of the fact that water supply being reduced, that's obviously a more healthy landscape and ultimately a positive thing. Okay, and so back to my photo collage, just to remind you how I'm viewing this. This is an example, the North Concho is an example of the woody plants have contributed to higher infiltration, and that the response of the landscape was that there was diminished stream flow because this was an overland flow dominated stream. In other words, and this photograph here is the North Concho River. The only time the North Concho River is flowing is when you get large rainfall events and you get overland flow, basically bypassing the transpiration. Okay, example number 2, most of our work has actually been in the Edwards Plateau. And to repeat myself again, the one reason for that is that it's such an important region in terms of water supply in Texas. This is it's a very large karst landscape that feeds the regionally important Edwards aquifer. And as I will show, the fascinating part of this is that the large-scale response to the increased infiltrability of the landscape is very different. And so this will be, I'm highlighting where the woody plants are contributed to higher infiltration, but because this is the rivers in the area are base flow dominated, the other remarkable and wonderful thing about the Edwards Plateau, even though it's in a semi-arid landscape, there are many perennial rivers that are coursing this landscape. And just highlighting the main result that we found when we're looking at historic stream flow across the region. I'm just showing one river. We looked at 4 different rivers, but we saw the same thing. So the top panel is composite average precipitation across the region. And the main take home from that is that rainfall has not changed during this time. The bottom panel is looking at stream flow, and I'd like you to just focus on the solid lines. This is a 10-year moving average. The black line is total stream flow, and then we did a base flow separation, and where you can sort out how much of is base flow and how much is storm flow. And the red line is the base flow, and that would be a surrogate for groundwater recharge in the region. And you see something, at least in my opinion, quite remarkable. So the drought of record, the big drought that happened in Texas, they still talk about it, the drought of the 1950s, and you can see how the base flow is dipping at this time. But since 1950, though, you can see this sort of gradual increase in base flow, but beginning around 1965, and this is when probably trees were expanding quite a bit, and also when cattle numbers were decreasing, a really dramatic increase in base flow that has maintained itself. And so these results were actually also controversial and shocking, because the popular perception was that because of the woody plants, springs were disappearing across this region. And what we argued, in fact, it was just the opposite. So during this period that we looked at, base flows were actually twice as high as what they were pre-1950. And again, so our hypothesis, I think with good reason, was that not only were cattle numbers decreasing, so you had better rangeland condition, but also the trees were actually directly increasing infiltrability of this landscape. We had good reason for that. We've done some large-scale rainfall simulation studies on hill slope scale. This was an experiment we were asking, does interflow happen in this landscape? And it turns out that it does, which was really a big surprise. But the other thing was that we could not make surface runoff happen underneath the juniper trees. But one could argue, okay, well, you haven't really comprehensively answered that question. So a PhD student, current PhD student, Pedro Leite, has done some very interesting work in terms of how do shrubs alter, the extent to which shrubs alter infiltrability. And what Pedro did was using this beer can method. He was, for one, he was able to do a lot of measurements, but also he separated out his measurements by tree size, and the results, in one sense, were not surprising. He showed that infiltration was really many, many times higher underneath the trees. But what was amazing to me was that even for the smallest shrub, and this is that photograph on the upper left, this may only be 20 or 30 centimeters high. For that shrub, that size category shrub, infiltration was on average about 5 times higher underneath the shrub than in the open area. So what Pedro has demonstrated that this change in infiltrability happens almost since a few years since the plant has germinated itself. So these results were really, like I said, in some ways not surprising, but in another sense very surprising that the trees have this big of an effect that soon. The work has been controversial. I'm not highlighting all of the work that we have done, but I'm just trying to categorize it in terms of what on the surface appears to be conflicting results. So, and the way that I try to understand this and explain it is that there's this slow water component in the landscape, and then there's a fast water component. And let's just go to the fast water that we know in the Edwards Plateau, because it is a karst landscape, that recharge happens almost immediately. And that's that lower graph. This is the well from, it's the key monitoring well from San Antonio. And this was for a large rainstorm event. But basically what it shows is that the aquifer completely recharged within a week's time from a large rainstorm event. Stream flow in Texas goes from almost nothing to huge amounts of water flowing across this landscape for large rain events. So there's definitely fast water that's happening, and I think that that's what's dominates is important in terms of water supply. And we've argued then that the trees are basically enhancing that, but others have argued differently using micrometeorological measurements, and these measurements have shown clearly that under trees there is higher transpiration, maybe by 50 millimeters a year, and that just doing the water budget approach, you would say, well, this extra water has got to be taken from somewhere. And the argument was made that, well, if you remove trees, then you can enhance groundwater recharge by 50 millimeters a year. But the thing is that these changes are based upon tiny incremental differences of maybe 0.07 millimeters a day. Well, you add that up across a year, and that adds up to real water. But it's very, very small changes. And so thinking a lot, how do we reconcile these apparent conflicts? And I've borrowed this idea that, again, Jeff has been very key in arguing and elaborating, is this two water worlds idea, our eco-hydrological separation. We think that there's potentially a water reservoir that the trees are accessing, but it's not necessarily, and they may be accessing it in the rocks, but it's not necessarily important in terms of groundwater recharge. And so working with Pedro is collaborating with Logan Schmidt, who's from the Daniela Rempe lab. You may know of Daniela, who's now at University of Texas, but worked in one of the critical zone observatories in California. And her work was very, got a lot of attention because she demonstrated that water storage and weathered rock was very, very important, both in terms of water dynamics, but also in terms of vegetation use. But Pedro and Logan are actually trying to answer this question of, are trees accessing water from either weathered rock or the more impermeable limestone that's often underneath that. So we're excited about this effort. Okay, so now my final example, and those students are going to be hanging on for the Zoom call. We can talk about this in more detail, but this is in South Texas. And it's a very different landscape, and the hydrologic result is different, but sort of the same kinds of things are happening. But I like this paper because a challenge I think many of us face is when we're presenting our research, how do we make this work of broad interest? As opposed to just if you happen to be interested in savannas in South Texas, that it would be interesting. And so we really struggled with this. Shishir Basant was the PhD student, and this is where this idea of couching it in terms of eco-hydrological connectivity came to us, and I'm curious to see whether or not this resonates with people or not. But the basic argument here, and the same sort of thing happened is in terms of the grazing history, very, very heavy grazing, and then grazing completely relaxed recently. And what that our work showed is that has an influence on the distribution of surface water. But the pattern of woody plant encroachment in this landscape is different than other places that I've shown you, and that you can see that the darker bands are the woody plants, and you can see that woody plants are expanding, but what this is showing is that woody plants are expanding in the low topographic relief drainage areas that crisscross this landscape. Lots of work has been done on this. It's called the La Copita Research Site. Tom Boughton, Jeff, and others who work in the isotope world may be familiar with Tom. Tom's done a lot of work using carbon isotopes to try to figure out the timing of these changes. But the hypothesis is that the upland areas are supplying water to the lowland areas, and this makes absolute sense. And Shishir designed a research study to try to determine the extent to which the uplands are supplementing the drainage areas, and he used neutron probe measurements in the uplands versus in the drainage areas. He had some large runoff plots, and then also looked at infiltration. And the gist of all of this is that during the 20-month period, even though there were some periods of very high rainfall, there was no transfer of water from the uplands to the drainage areas. So from that data, we made an argument, and then looking at sort of historic grazing patterns, comparing areas that are currently grazed with this area that has not been grazed for 40 years, we made the argument that this landscape that has, during the recovery, that water redistribution has changed. And so the basic argument that we've made is that in savanna systems with overgrazing, will alter infiltrability, which then alters surface runoff, and that essentially changes how water is redistributed across the landscape. In this case, with the heavy grazing, we're arguing that water then was being redistributed to the drainage areas, allowing the woody plant encroachment to happen. But then eventually, with the relaxation of grazing, then we get what we call the collapse of eco-hydrological connectivity. And basically that surface runoff is not happening anymore. And we've argued, and in our discussions, you guys can perhaps challenge me on this, is that we believe it's very likely that this model can be applied to tropical savanna systems across the globe. That when you get these savanna systems that are overgrazed, you'll get a redistribution of water, and that can have important ecological effects. But with the recovery of grazing, then you get the reverse of that, and we call this the collapse of eco-hydrological connectivity. But after writing that paper, I realized that this concept applies to really our other sites as well. And so just to kind of recap, what I'm showing you is that west of the PET line, where potential evapotranspiration is less than rainfall, the driving change is really the change in infiltrability. And this has obviously effects at the small scale, but I think what's interesting and important is that we've shown that it has changes at it has large scale implications, but these implications differ depending upon the soils, the topography, the geology, and I'm making the argument, and I'm in the very early stages now of trying to write a paper to make this argument, is that the eco-hydrological connectivity concept is useful in terms of understanding and generalizing this change in woody plant encroachment. Okay, I'm transitioning now. Jeff, am I doing okay with, I'm about out of time. But I'll just take, if I can, 5 minutes in terms of the larger scale implications in terms of, well, I know that this course is working on water security. I'm not sure we can make an argument that this change has strong water security implications, but it certainly has economic security implications. So landowners across this region are stressed, not only because of woody plant encroachment, but because of a changing climate with now we have increased danger of wildfire, I said, and then also with drought. And in terms of really trying to develop a deeper understanding of the woody plant encroachment problem, we've adopted this social ecological systems approach. And so this was our team member, our NSF team members for the Coupled Human Dimension team. But I think the important thing was the interaction with social scientists and ecologists and hydrologists to try to gain a deeper understanding. And what that did was that provided us, I think, a framework and an understanding to argue that there are better ways of managing this landscape across the region. And with this project, what we're trying to do is basically a large-scale cultural shift in the use of fire, all the way from Nebraska to central Texas. And then, but combining innovative use of fire for managing the landscape, but also combining that with returning browsers back to the grazing guild. And what we're arguing is that if landowners adapt this, that they'll be in a better position in terms of more resilient management. And so that's what we're in the midst of right now. It's a large-scale project involving extension, education, and then research across the region. And with that, I will end my talk, and thank you again for listening to some of these ideas.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. That was like listening to a hydrological symphony. We had many movements, and it was yeah, really exciting to see the whole thing kind of in total there. So we're on the edge of our time, but I want to have opportunity for some general audience questions before we transition to the journal club. So again, as Kim mentioned, we'll take some questions in the chat. I think there's already perhaps one or two there. I don't know if you can see them, Brad, or I could read them. That might be interesting. That might be interesting.
Yeah, I can't see them, so yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. You know, we're sitting in the northern Great Plains, just over the border, but in a kind of a similar ecosystem in many ways. And you think about the connectivity you talked about in the paper in that last example. For us, it maybe relates to these these frozen ground and the brief window of melt onto frozen ground. And that's when we get our overland flow and runoff generated. so it's like, I don't know, 11 months of the year, it's hydrological boredom in terms of 1D, wicking away of any precip that falls. And our annual precip here is about 300 millimeters or so, let's say 350. But then during those 3 weeks of melt on frozen ground, all hell breaks loose and we get significant overland flow. And if the soils freeze wet, then, it's pretty significant amounts of overland flow. But maybe our situation is, as things warm up, maybe we start to lose our cold. And if we do, then our overland flow kind of goes away. And there have been plots not so far from Saskatoon that have been recording overland flow over the last 50, 60 years. And the windows during summer are, very rare indeed. So it's just very interesting to reflect from our situation on your, on the descriptions you made. Anyway, let me go to questions that you can then respond to here. Thanks for an interesting talk. I understand, this is from Britta. I understand that at the plot scale, infiltration under trees and shrubs is higher than in surrounding bare areas. But does this also hold for total infiltration at the landscape scale if shrublands are directly compared to grasslands? In the areas I work in African savannas, my impression was different. More water was lost to runoff when grass cover went down, leading to lower infiltration.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting observation. And I don't know if you recall that one slide that I showed with, as you go from arid to subhumid, the response to woody plant encroachment can, in terms of changes in the inner canopy, can differ. So depending if it's in a dry enough landscape with woody plant encroachment, your inner canopy cover can diminish significantly, and that will actually result in higher runoff. So it gets complicated. It does get complicated. In fact, Enrique Vivoni just had a paper talking about woody plant encroachment increases groundwater recharge in the Southwest because of the shift from grasslands to creosote, and that increased the eco-hydrological connectivity because of the degradation of the interspaces. So it's actually, I think it depends upon the climate, it depends upon the grazing level as well. But I get this question a lot. What if we could return to pristine grasslands? What would the difference be? And obviously I can't answer that question. I think in both cases, pristine grasslands and woody plant cover with low grazing have high infiltrability.
Mm-hmm. Certainly your groundwater recharge under the woody plant encroachment, couldn't that be explained by preferential flow to depth, despite the fact that you've got higher transpirational demands by the trees? When you do get events, it's almost though you're creating the superhighway to get water deeper. And sure, in between events, you're getting more wicking, but the preferential flow is the aid to groundwater recharge.
I think that's very true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Brad, I'm aware that we're about 5 minutes over, and we're going to thank you for a lovely talk. That really was great to hear the whole thing together. It's almost your last 20 years work described in a really exciting eco-hydrological tour. We're going to transition now to the class discussion of the paper. So I'll bring this meeting to an end, and thank you again, Brad, for being with us. We'll see you momentarily on Zoom, and
Okay.
We'll see everybody next week with Kathy Wilson from Los Alamos Lab.
Thank you.
Thanks.